the Queen was inhabiting a largely symbolic role at this point. And as we saw in the very first lecture I gave, I think, and I talked about the way in which her family and the presentation of her family was meant to be a way of trying to restore the credibility of the royal family after all of the drama that had followed the abdication crisis of 1936. That's a longer answer that you wanted. Did I see a hand go up over here? No? Yeah? They were basically doing considerably better, and Germany is always the great example because, you know, German industry is basically redeveloped in part with, and the French economy as well, and the Marshall Plan is very, very important there. And so whereas Britain is stuck with industrial plant that is basically Victorian in origin, the Germans basically develop a much more modern forms of industrial production that helps them become a far more productive and prosperous West Germany we're talking about, obviously, country. Yeah. In the interwar years, the percentage of world exports was around 30%. I don't have the exact, but it's around that figure. So this is a decline, remember, that begins really back in the 1920s when Britain goes back onto the gold standard, and suddenly the price of British exports go through the roof, and the textile industry, you know, which had been one of the mainstays of the export economy, begins to tail off. So we are talking about, you know, a longer term process. Anybody else? Let's move on. Consensus and restraint. Why do I put one of my pet hates? If I was going to make a nomination for end of semester award ceremony, one of my pet hates would be the worst slide heading. Or why is it that, you know, Vernon always puts a question mark at the end of everything? It's just deeply irritating. So I'm suggesting here that, as I did at the very beginning of the lecture, that because all the main political parties basically agree about the main outlines of how you manage this social democratic system, that in some ways this becomes an unideological age. It's certainly true that people began to have a different taste for political leaders. And the question is, was this driven by a turn away from ideological differences, or was it produced by the new styles of presenting politics on TV? Ellen Wilkinson, who had led the Jarrow Hunger March and was on the left of the Labour Party in the 1930s, wrote in 1946, "In politics now, glamour has definitely passed. The fashion is all for the quiet, competent, efficient man of affairs who gets on with his job with a minimum of fuss and limelight. And into this era, Mr. Attlee fits perfectly." So she's suggesting there that the old firebrand orators of old, who would whip up, you know, people into an ideological frenzy, had been displaced by people like Attlee, who seemed perfect technocrats to manage this new system. And really, the story of Nye Bevan and Owen Bevan is a perfect illustration of this. Remember, Nye Bevan was the Minister of Housing and Health in the Labour government, and he famously gave a speech. I tried all morning to find you a clip of Nye Bevan speaking, because he was an unbelievable orator out of the South Wales mining communities, and a man on the left of the Labour Party, a man who began every speech by addressing people as comrades. And he did a very famous speech in Bellevue in Manchester in 1948, for which he caught a lot of criticism, and this is the key passage. In my early life, I had to live on the earnings of an elder sister and was told to emigrate. That is why no amount of cajolery, no attempt at ethical or social seduction can eradicate from my heart a deep, burning hatred for the Tory party that inflicted those bitter experiences. So far as I'm concerned, they are lower than vermin. Okay? This is a politician talking about members of the not just a politician, a government minister talking about his colleagues on the other side of the House in the Commons. Bevan was thought by many people to be the leader in waiting of the Labour Party, but for a variety of reasons, he resigns in 1951. It wasn't because of this speech, and he's beaten by Hugh Gaitskell, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Labour administration, to become leader in 1951. And then after Gaitskell, you have the election of Harold Wilson, who really is a technocratic type of figure, walked around in a white anorak, not Macintosh, you know, like a Flasher's Macintosh. But it wasn't Harold Wilson who did my mum, I can promise you. The point is that type of oratory, loaded with ideological heat and pounded on, you know, people would pace up and down and gesticulate madly and do that whole fantastic oratorical thing, was becoming a thing of the past. And in part it was becoming a thing of the past because now the way that politicians reached their audience was less the mass meeting that people like Nye Bevan were so good at than the television broadcast. So here you have a picture of Macmillan doing a television broadcast. And so one of the big stories here is simply about the arrival of TV into people's homes, and you have the figures behind you. Macmillan said, almost everything that one has learnt for public speaking at mass meetings has to be forgotten for a television performance. One has to remind oneself all the time that it's not a speech, but a conversation, and that the audience, however large in the aggregate, in fact consists of 2 or 3 persons sitting quietly in a room, not subjected to any of the emotions which can be stirred in a great public meeting. So when you communicate politics on TV, you do it in this tamed down way. You don't have to carry the room. And election broadcasts and party political broadcasts, as they're known in Britain, began to reach an increasing share of the population, which is why politicians did it. In 1951, 10% of the electorate saw the first party political broadcast. In 1955, that had increased to 33%. By 1966, 85% of the population were watching party political broadcasts. And you see that alongside those figures are the diminishing size of the radio audience, which of course had been very important from the 1930s through the 1930s and the 1940s. It's actually the Labour Party which is at the forefront of trying to embrace the new media of television. Very often people present the Conservative Party from Stanley Baldwin in the 1920s and 30s, and figures like Harold Macmillan as being at the forefront, but the Labour Party actually was equally innovative in its use of the new mass media. Tony Benn, the Labour MP who moved increasingly to the left of the party through the 1970s and 1980s, had set up the Labour's television and radio room in 1959. And that room, which was basically a BBC studio, was meant to manage the news agenda. Okay, which basically became a what does CNN sort of describe that silly way that they broadcast news? The hot room or the situation room? Oh my goodness. The situation room, yeah. So in a way, it's like a situation room where the Labour Party is setting out broadcasts in order to capture the news agenda for the nightly broadcast and then for the following day's newspapers, which of course is now what everybody does. And I'm going to play you a clip of.
There now follows a party political broadcast on behalf of the Labour Party.
This is it.
It's an election broadcast on behalf of the Labour Party.
This is our television operations room. Throughout the campaign, the leaders of the Labour Party will be speaking directly from here. We've got a sort of permanent staff here. Christopher Mayhew is looking after facts and figures. When there's any interviewing to be done, the questions will be put by Woodrow Wyatt, and I'm going to give some of the news of the campaign. Britain Belongs to You will be on the air in this form 12 times between now and polling day, on sound and BBC and independent television. Tonight, Hugh Gaitskell is here to open our campaign. Tomorrow he sets off on his national tour, and in future programs we'll be linking up with him from other cities in Great Britain.
Good evening. The most important thing that's happening in the world just at the moment is not Mr. Jasper and his companies, but Mr. Khrushchev's visit to the United States. I don't think we should be too depressed by the rows that we keep hearing about. When we came back from the Soviet Union about 10 days or a fortnight ago, I gave an account of our meeting with Mr. Khrushchev.
All right, enough. The rest of that is up online, and it actually gets much more interesting, and they do a whole bunch of different types of segments in the broadcast, which itself was a very novel thing, because the party political had usually been someone like Hugh Gaitskell sitting at a desk, often with a crackling fire and, a row of books to make them seem sort of learned and intelligent, talking intently into a camera. So the new magazine format was actually something that was really pretty novel. But I don't want you to think that suddenly the old world of politics has completely disappeared and now nobody does anything but consume politics alongside adverts for soap powders on the TV. That wasn't the case. There were continuing forms of mass mobilization by a variety of different types of political forms. Probably most striking are the two examples of the last legs of the fascist movement with Oswald Mosley. Oswald Mosley, after the war, sets up a new party and campaigns for election in Notting Hill in 1958, and holds a lot. You'll see this in next week. I'll talk about this more. Holds a lot of mass rallies. The other great example is the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which was set up in 1958 and staged something that looked very, very familiar to the old movements for reform or for the old hunger march